get started. A warm welcome to the Courtauld this evening. I'm Robin Schuldenfrei, lecturer in 20th century modernism and organizer of the ongoing research seminar series, Modernities, Architecture, Design, Theory. This evening, I'm delighted to present some roles in drawing, which has been organized in collaboration with the somewhat recently formed Courtauld Architecture Society, led by Matthew Page. We're interested in focusing our attention anew this evening on the architectural process, from the nascent steps surrounding a new commission, to the stage of drawing, to the physical object as built, before moving to a discussion that is at the heart of our thinking for this evening. And the R in this is a collaboration with Matthew and other members of the Architecture Society. And in no way do I want to take credit for this evening, but rather it's a true collaboration of which I hope there's many more between the students and the faculty here at the Courtauld. But the discussion that's at the heart of our thinking this evening is the afterlives of drawings. But what do we mean when we say afterlives of drawings? At a point in time, architectural drawings prefigure the buildings that they depict. Once these buildings are constructed, the drawings take on a different role. Whereas they are once predictive, they become retrospective. What becomes of these drawings? What potential afterlives might they have? How do they figure in histories of architecture? We don't take the mark on the paper made by the architect to be fixed to a place and a time, but rather a more expansive position. That is, it is indexical, indeed related to the exigencies of its origins, but also that architectural drawings can allow us to see through, around, and into design processes. They are representations of both a kind of thinking and a kind of delineation. And those representations, of course, are not stable, but play a crucial role in bridging the built and the unbuilt, the architect and his vision, the material and the immaterial, realities and desires. Architectural drawings are stand-ins for buildings, styles, movements, groups. And they are standouts, unique works of art, fragile, layered, palimpsests, tangible, with homes in collections and institutions, and sometimes relegated, in the case of Mies van der Rohe's early work, to the wastebins of history. To this very visual and this very material understanding, we hope to also grasp at larger, more ephemeral issues to architectural drawings being in the world. So, first we'll have a presentation from Tony Fretton, the architect. He is principal of Tony Fretton Architects and holds teaching positions at Delft University of Technology, the University of East London, and the CAS. His projects include the Lisson Gallery, a house for Anish Kapoor, Fuglsang Art Museum in Denmark, and the Deinze Town Hall in Belgium. In designing the first Lisson Gallery building beginning in 1987, Tony established a new personal position as an architect relating the social meaning of the elements of a building to their connections to the district around them. This became the operative position for his practice. Tonight, he will discuss the development of this approach and the roles that drawings played in it. Welcome. We're just starting, really. This talk will be followed by a conversation on the roles of drawing after architectural practice with Olivia Horsfall Turner and Niall Hobhouse, who I will just briefly introduce because we'll have Tony Fretton's presentation and then we'll go straight to the discussion. Dr. Olivia Horsfall Turner is an architectural historian, curator, and writer. She is senior curator of design at the V&A, where she is responsible for the National Collection of Design Drawings, which documents the creative processes in art, architecture, and design from the 14th century to the present day. Niall Hobhouse collects drawings by architects. He curates exhibitions and writes about buildings, landscapes, and museums. He established Drawing Matter Trust to explore the role of drawing within architecture, architectural memory, and exhibitions. Many of us here this evening, students, faculty, and those involved with architecture in some form or another, have had the edifying experience of viewing this outstanding collection firsthand. So now I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our first speaker this evening, Tony Fretton. Welcome.
Well, thank you for the introduction. And it did touch on one thing that I wondered how I would speak about, which was that at a certain moment when I had the Lisson Gallery project, the first one, there were two Lisson Galleries, one in, and then later, there was another one. Anyway, the projects are so odd, they're beginning to lie about their age. So the first one was interesting because it was, I'd seen Nicholas Logsdale, and he had suggested he might buy a warehouse in Clerkenwell, and I looked at it for him and said, why did he want to do it? And then, so I thought I'd lost that job. And then 2 years later, he invited me to his gallery, which was extraordinary. It was a shop with artworks that filled the room, with a kind of incomprehending society around it, wondering what it was all about. And Nicholas showed me this building. What's happening here? There's a performance work going on in front of me. But I'm all right with this, because we're going to get to performance in a minute. And I have to be quick. So he showed me a tobacconist store in a side street. And Anish Kapoor came. Anish was a kind of young, very immediately successful artist. And I looked at this building and I thought, it's awful. What am I going to do with it? But I'm not going to lose this job. So I said, I'm sure we can do something with this. And Anish looked like he thought Nicholas had gone mad. What turned out was that Nicholas had a very particular instinct, and he bought parts of the surrounding area. He ended up with a building that we made, and then he bought other sites and made a second building. But at that time, architecture was in a strange state. This was in the mid-80s and 90s, I can't remember. But anyway, architecture had given itself to postmodernism, which initially was interesting, but actually became less and less interesting. And at the same time that was happening, London was alight with music, with punk and performance. And I have to confess I was rather agedly involved in both. But the performance, which I worked in a company called Station House Opera, let me see something, which was that they were working with the same material as I was as an architect, which would be people, objects, places. And yet they were saying things with it which I couldn't make architecture say, because I wanted architecture to be as inquiring about things as the arts. And so I discovered that what I discovered, of course, was some conceptual art through the performance company's position was conceptual. And then it made me realize that anything that I used, all the habitual stuff that you used in architecture, doors and windows and things like that, could be made to say something. Because, I was also looking at the Judd and people like that. So that's the background to the sketches. Now, what I need to say is that the sketches were only part of how the scheme developed. So there were, of course, models and delineated drawings. And this is something interesting about the difference between the designer and a curator or a theorist or a collector of drawings, which is that you make drawings sort of volitionally without knowing why you're making. Well, in a very narrow sense why you make them, because they tell you something, but then they have all sorts of other content, which it's only becomes apparent when you're put in positions like this and you're compelled to find depth instead of just saying, I did it and I did that. So what I'll do, I actually can see my presentation in the back window, so I'm all right. I know where I am now. It's a bit far away. I haven't got my glasses on, but so this first drawing, which of course I can't see in the window, is says Lisson Sketchbooks, and this drawing. Sometimes when you're an architect, you make drawings to tell you that the project is going okay. Well, I do. I mean, each architect has a different use for drawings. But for me, this was to say that the first Lisson Gallery had amounted to something, and it had, within its spatial configuration, which were made by a series of independent choices, overall it had some geometric connection, which for an architect is important. Somehow your work comes in a series of intense, intuitive ideas, and then it's brought to a kind of order and often edited to give it that order. But this is the outside of the Lisson Gallery, and what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at a very typical London building, and so what the following sketches will talk about is how the typicality of that could work. And interestingly, when I was photographing the building, a man from the taxi company next door came and said, what are you photographing? And I said, this art gallery. And he looked at it and he said, where is it? And I thought, I got it right. You know, he couldn't see it. So these really, it's difficult to, well, I'm going to sit sideways and see if I can do this. These are to look at how the front of the building would be made, and I mean, it seems completely incidental. You know, how do you get the rainwater to disperse? How do you do that demonstratively rather than concealing it? And what can that mean? And things like the lock on the door. So if you have adopted the position that I described of wanting each part, even though they were ordinary things, to have some vocal quality, then you look for things like that. There's actually an amusing story. It's a true story. Nicholas came back from America with a Frank Lloyd Wright door handle, which he said, I want you to put this on the front of the building. And I said, I'm not going to, you know. And so I became anxious about this door handle, and I used to eat a lot when I got anxious. And then finally, when I got the door handle I wanted, I went to the fridge to make a giant sandwich by way of consolation, realised that I'd replicated the door handle of my fridge. It's true, actually. So these things happen. It is a true story. And so, even the way that the rainwater is taken off becomes important. But actually, this is this attention to detail is something that hasn't left me. And when I teach, which I do, I get students to understand, I hope, that the ideas, the larger ideas of a project can be crystallized in the detail that you make. And I say nothing should escape the eye of a designer. Hi, do come in. So this describes what it's like. But the first gallery was narrow, and it had wooden boards, and then the one at the back had paving slabs. And then at the back there was a gallery which I'll show, I hope, in a little later. But so the feeling I had was to make a series of spaces which had different scales and acoustics according to their floor. So I became interested in how architecture wouldn't exist simply visually, but it would exist in a broader range of experientiality. And that, for me, was important because I was looking at art galleries that were being made, which were visually so strong that somehow they competed with the work. You know, they were ornamental, and I made a decision, which I still operate, that that the art spaces should support the artworks, and it didn't matter if they didn't look particularly good if they're empty. They should look good when they're full, and they should look good when they're full with very different artworks. And so if you want to do that, if you reduce the visual inventiveness that you will use, you then become interested in things like sound or the sensation of walking through a space and changing level. And this is the back gallery. What's interesting was the space had this unusual shape. Somehow it was a product of the spaces that Nicholas collected bit by bit. But what I think I'd realized was that this place, which was remote, it wasn't in Cork Street. You had some distance to go to get to it, and you went through a district that had a particular character, and it had particular scales and geometries, and those scales and geometries continued in the space that I made, but were translated in the kind of white architecture of gallery work, because there was a demand for the Lisson that they would project themselves onto a world stage using the vocabulary that was being made for art spaces. So that vocabulary also became something to be considered and used. And the basement, basements in art galleries are always the most beautiful spaces, but then they get turned into storerooms. But this is the basement in the first Lisson Gallery, and you look up to the light in the other gallery. But what I want to talk about here is the staircase and how it could be, what it could fall. It's, as a design, it could fall somewhere between the type of staircase that you would find in a New York loft, which was, in a way, the New York art scene through the use of lofts was had a defining process in the way that British art galleries saw themselves. You know, Nicholas and Lisson Gallery wanted to be taken seriously in America. Actually, at that time, was the place to be taken seriously. So, but it also, you know, it was a ladder that you might find in a fisherman's loft in Cornwall, and so in a way also you wanted to make a staircase which had a certain type of presence and certain type of visuality and would be consistent with the kind of work that was being made at the time, you know, like LeWitt's wooden structures. And then one thought about how doors were made, and I made a decision that we would just use door panels you could buy anywhere, and look at how these things were made. If you look in any building which hasn't been made with conscious design, there's often a lot of things that happen that are really quite exciting, and like joining things in the corner, or you know, a sort of pragmatic decisions that were made, and they also seem to me to embody a whole body of making, which is outside architecture, which is usually ignored, which is like I don't know, knitting or DIYW, which is excluded from the discussion of object making, but actually to me has an intense social value. These kinds of mistakes are made by people who have intentions, and so another aspect of looking at the objects which would constitute a building was that they could have this kind of background. And then if you wanted to make a bigger door, you added around the edges. So in a way, it also somehow it had some consistency with the work that I saw people like LeWitt making, where you had series of things. And then this building that I've just described was linked to this new building, and this drawing is of that new building, and that's the old building I've just described, and this is the new building here. And I drew this sometime after I designed it, again like the first drawing, to have faith in the project somehow, to have faith that everything that I'd done made sense. And that is how I work. And it looks like this. I mean, the building unconsciously has rhyming relationships with things in the distance, and the reflection of the outside is as important as what you see inside, and it has relationships with the building next door to it, which I'll show you sketches of. And then through having to be connected to the earlier building, which was had a floor level rather than the street, we ended up with this, which means that people on the outside have the upper hand. Usually in the art world, you walk by the window and there are people inside who are framed and made special. Here you're kind of demoted. So for me that was interesting. And then these were looking at how a facade might be made a bit, which had the characteristics of where use and appearance were very close, as in a boomerang, for example. And always with this desire for transparency, which came from a conversation with the artist. I think it was Richard Deacon said that window figures, such as we see in this room, which are dark, he found very troublesome as a background to sculpture. And I said, well, then we won't have any windows, we'll just have the view. And that turned out to be a rather interesting decision, because, as I hope to show you, some artists work with the view and others treat it ambiently. But again, in a gallery there are lights and air conditioning, and how can you handle them in the way, according to the doctrine that I'd established, not as decorative or as invisible, but how could you incorporate them in this overall design? How could they matter? Don't join the corners, for example, makes it a different figure on the ceiling. And then, of course, the relationship of the older building to the new building, how it might be, how it, in a way, in a purely architectural way, or how could it be? What would the experience be to walk past that shop front and see this space on the left, but also see your reflection and wonder if your hair was on straight and things like that? Like, we all use buildings in the way that's natural and I like and try to participate in. And then the upper floors, which are where their offices now. But what struck me with this photograph was that how hardly anything changed in that city. How it had stayed like this forever, and how unconsciously the gallery had seen this relationship. And then this view doesn't exist anymore because Piers Goff did a huge building here. But we commissioned a client of ours who was a Magnum photographer, Chris Steele Perkins, to photograph the building. And then you realise why photographers are good. For some reason, he found the day when the elevated highway here was closed for works, and he could get up on it and take this photograph. I suppose that's what you're like if you're a photographer. But what I like is the rhyming relationship between this. these relationships, they don't exist anymore. And one thing I learned from this building, and looking at some of Caesar's buildings that seek these ephemeral relationships, is that, well, they disappear. And the back elevation, this was a drawing. I knew what I wanted to do, but somehow I wanted to reassure myself that I wanted to do it. And these are views of the composition of the bits at the back of the building, and how the window and the air conditioning unit could talk to each other. And then the staircases. These staircases were really interesting for me. They do all sorts of things that look functional, but they're not. I'm always intrigued when you see roadworks and you see precast elements which are going to be constructed into something which have really very beautiful shapes, and you don't know what they're for. And I wanted to somehow explore that as sort of non-functionalist representational thing. In fact, before I became an architect, I used to work in construction, and I always found the excavation and the construction materials the most beautiful part. And so one looks at things like that. And this screen is supported with pins like that. And then this stair hammer is really interesting because, of course, they're innocent, but you experience them the whole time. So this is a flat which has got a particular feeling. It's not wide. It doesn't stress your hand. And when you connect stairs, sometimes you make sometimes you make the hand rod jump. Depends how you lay out the stair. If you have them the same, then you end up with what's called a ramp, and you discover that metalworkers can do all of this stuff. It's not magic to them; they just do it. And so there's a certain quality, such as I described, of objects that are made by other people than yourself, which are full of their history, but it's an innocent history. And then, should it be like that or should it be like this? And how do you fix the glass? And then what, in the end, is the room itself like, with glass and 3 walls? And it ended up like this. It ended up as a space when you came into the back. Having left the city, you came into the building and then you rediscovered it. Now, that's then, and this is now. So I draw differently now. And this is a recent building, or pair of buildings in Antwerp. And I'll show the digital drawings. I did an experiment to, when I used to do sketches, my colleagues in the office would say, look, we want those sketches because we can find things in it that you don't necessarily know are there, and we can build from them. So there was a laborious process of tearing out pages from sketchbooks and putting them in a folder. And then our administrator left, so nobody else wanted to do that. And I bought an iPad, and I thought I'd draw on an iPad, which meant that I could send them digitally to people. And I did for about 2 weeks, and then that didn't work. It's really strange how things don't work. You discover in architecture, you propose something, and then what you build comes from another place, from some practicality. So this is what makes design different from writing or theory. It's a completely different way of thinking, which gets hardly any discussion because it's hard to legitimate it. So I've given up trying to legitimate it. I'm just describing it, and it's not unusual. It's the same kind of mentality that we use to cook a meal or to fall in love with somebody or buy a bicycle. It's a very human set of intuitions. So, and this was my first foray. Well, it wasn't. Maybe there are others, but on an iPad with my finger, and these were to reassure me that I was going in the right direction. And then we're looking at projecting brickwork and what it would be like next to the window, and it's like that, so you can see the fabric of the building, you can reach around and touch it. And these are just to show you that something I like, which is that you can start, if you have a good idea, it can be a very simple idea, because all architectural ideas elaborate themselves curiously. So, should it be Roman and Belgian, or should it be Belgian and Roman? Thank you. That's it. I did give a lecture once where somebody asked a question in the first word. That was a bit alarming. But she wasn't quite well organised in her thoughts, and she left. But anyway, I did my best. I said, "Can you wait?" No, it was too much, really.
Well, first of all, thank you for giving us this introduction to your work and your working processes, and I think that segues us nicely into what's to come. So I'll turn it over to Matthew.
Yeah, so as Robin said in her introduction, the concern of this second part of this session is the afterlives of drawings after they've been produced and used by architects. And so in addition to Tony, we've invited Dr. Olivia Horsfall Turner and Niall Hobhouse to discuss this. But I thought perhaps a useful introduction to Niall and Olivia was to look at two spaces that architectural drawings can potentially end up in. And just to give you some context for these and Olivia and Niall's connections to them. So I've got some series, two sets of images. One describes the drawing matter collection that Niall is intimately involved with, and the other are images from the Victoria and Albert Museum, which you may be much more familiar with. So I've just got 2 or 3 images up here on the screen, and I wondered if Niall might like to describe what's happening in them and what they're showing.
So this was a...
Need a microphone.
I'm sorry. So, excuse me. So this was the delivery of a single drawing made by a group of architects who described themselves as the Grunt Group.
Well, they didn't. They were called the Grunt Group, and they hated it.
Oh, in fact, they answer to it now.
Well, they've become history.
And I think that's and there are 3 of the 4 architects. The 4th one, Edward Jones, was, I think, at his house in the south of France for the presentation. They had produced this drawing together of a housing development at Milton Keynes, which they had done for the Development Corporation, and had chosen to put all the information of the scheme onto a single sheet of paper, which is 5 or 6 meters long. The opportunity for me as a collector was sort of not clear to any of them who owned it, and I was able to suggest that I would give it a home and nurture the legacy. It happened that we had visitors there for another occasion, and so asked the 3 who were there to describe the making of the drawing, which they actually, there's a funny film on the Drawing Matter website. It's not, I hope none of them are here today. It's not clear that they agreed at all, either about the history of the drawing or who was doing what within the practice. Very important for me to gather that story while it's still possible to gather it in the form that is, in the most immediate form we possibly can. It's also the basis on which my colleague Gina DiCarlo interviewed Tony around his sketchbooks and the Lisson Gallery sketchbooks, and the publication is there. With these drawings by living architects, one has a unique opportunity to collect both the story and the object, and in relation to, less perhaps to this grant group drawing, but in relation to the sketchbooks, that is incredibly valuable as a research tool, and has become really almost a condition of our adding sketchbooks to the collection.
Would you like or mind talking about the building itself in which the collection's housed?
For the architects here, it's the first time anybody has tried to build in the UK in cross-laminated timber with no membrane and no insulation layer. The thinking is that the solid timber, the mass of the solid timber, so there's no void either, I should say. The mass of the solid timber absorbs stabilizes the heat. The timber absorbs the moisture. So it was like a 10 cents on the dollar solution to the mass storage of paper. Olivia is laughing at me. From my point of view, there's some guy at the University of Leicester who has monitors all over the building, but he will never give me his report. So I can't tell you if it's a success in environmental terms, but I kind of like it as a proposition. The key part of the brief to the architect Hugh Strange was that it should be a wonderful space with natural light in which one could look at the drawings. And it was based on the expectation that a group of 15 people is probably the maximum that can gather around a single drawing. So we didn't want a more substantial or a grander space, because one was so quickly then tempted to invite too many people in, and it became a kind of grandstanding operation, which is and the attention very quickly drifts away from the drawing itself.
Just a follow-up question for that. So you've actually presented a really nice triangle between the drawing as object, the people living who surround the object to discuss it or to consider it, to experience themselves, so between people and object. And then this third part, the story of its coming into being. Of course, we can only gather those stories for when the architects are still around it, or also the children. I know that you're also good about doing that. I was just wondering if you could share with us, especially students who may be doing interviews for their own writing, how you gather the story, because I think it's going to be similar and different than what the procedure at the V&A might be, the connection of the object to the person, the story the person may tell. Do you see yourself as formulating questions, or is it an ongoing dialogue? What's your kind of own take on that relationship?
I'd love to hear Olivia's answer.
Yes, I'm going to ask you to. You can answer too.
It's of course has to be very opportunistic. I think the most the most successful occasion was, in my memory, it's probably that I was there, was when we were working, or just starting to work on the comparable volume to Tony's with Alvaro Caesar. Part of it, so the sequence of events was that Manuel Montenegro and I had the idea that we could simply film Caesar talking about this, his sketchbooks. Manuel sent me a list. I put, I shouldn't say this, but Penelope in the room, I put 12...
You should say.
I put 12 sketchbooks into my briefcase. I didn't get an export license. Flew to Porto, where I guess they were illegal entrants. We put them in front of Caesar, set a camera above his head, gave him his ashtray, and filmed him for 4 or 5 hours. What was wonderful was, and this was the same with Tony, this process of looking again at something you possibly haven't opened, in that case for 40 years. It carried him back there in a way that I think was powerful for him too. Kept him on message. Prevented him. I mean, he's the last show-off in the world, but it kept him from discoursing about what he wanted to be as an architect. What I hadn't realised in this process, or rather I realised only after about half an hour, is that Manuel, who is writing a thesis on Caesar's early work, was using the occasion of the interview to get Caesar to say on camera the full key points. No, I'm not a contextualist. Yes, there was a modern architecture in Portugal before Salazar. I mean, these really key points that are of fantastic political moment in Portugal. And they were terrific. And Caesar went, "Oh, contextualist, never." That's fantastic. Anyway, Olivia.
Should we ask
Yeah.
Go one forward.
Oh yeah, sure, sure.
I do want to.
Yes,
yes, yes.
Before we've been put into context.
Yeah, so good. So yeah, would you like to explain what these images
So
are showing?
these two images show two areas in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I'm sure some of you at least will be familiar with. On the top, the Architecture Gallery, which is a shared collaboration between the RIBA and the V&A, where objects from both collections are on long-term display. We do change things when necessary, but that's basically the permanent Architecture Gallery. And then below, the RIBA side of the V&A RIBA study rooms. And it's interesting to me that Matt's chosen the RIBA side, which is, I have to confess, a much more glamorous and beautifully decorated side to the study room. The V&A side to the study room is rather barren. The walls are bare, whereas the RIBA shows their oil paintings, their portraits, and has models actually on display, so that the room is enlivened even before you've pulled anything out from the stacks. But that space is available 4 days a week for members of the public to order up material from the RIBA and from the V&A side by side. There are slight differences, obviously, in terms of what you can look at on one side and the other. The RIBA is solely focused on architecture or work produced by architects, so furniture design as well, and interior design too. But the V&A collection of designs spans all manner of object, textile designs, woodworks, ceramics, sculpture, and all the architectural drawings. So one of the advantages, therefore, is that you're looking at architecture within the whole with a whole range of productive disciplines, that the whole scope of art and design is broadened, and architecture sits in conversation with those different disciplines. So this is where people encounter architectural drawings most intimately in V&A. In the Architecture Gallery, we have drawings on display behind glass or in drawers, but in the study room, people are pulling them out of boxes, sometimes in Melinex, sometimes naked drawings, as it were, sketchbooks, and being able to handle them directly. And as we talked about in the session, the sketchbook handling session before this evening's lecture from Tony, that's a tremendously important part, that the haptic experience of understanding what the object is actually made of and how it feels and how it smells is all part of understanding it. So that's the sort of context for where we keep our drawings.
How do you navigate? I mean, as a visitor, you need to come knowing more or less what you want to look at.
There are two ways. Either you come having identified things in the catalogue, so there are online catalogues. There's a visual catalogue, a catalogue where you can see images. There's also an old paper catalogue. And as a research tip, you need to check both because they don't actually completely marry up. There's a processing gap, a data collections management gap between the paper archive and the online catalogues. So people either know that they want to find a particular drawing, or they're interested in a particular architect, or they're interested in a particular topographical area, or they're interested in a particular building. And then it's also very much a process, I mean, as with you, Neil, of the personal knowledge of the collection. So the staff who man the study room desk are all curators. Quite often we're there and we're bringing boxes out for people, and somebody will say, I'd like to talk to the curator about this. And so this is she. Like, no, I want to talk to the curator, and there's often a kind of gap there. So there are things that are hard to find just because of the cataloguing system, and so talking with people about the collection is a fundamental part of the experience. Yeah.
Does that then form, so if Neil's part of the collection is the object and the story and the space, does that form your part of the story? Where does the story then enter into a more formal space or a historical collection like Reba? I mean, when did Reba start collecting?
Reba started collecting in the 1830s.
Yeah, 1830, so that's a long...
and the V&A started collecting, well, in the 1840s in the Government School of Art and Design, and then in 1857 when the V&A opened. So in fact, the V&A's collections predate the V&A. The story is absolutely fundamental. I mean, our opportunities, obviously, to collect the story are determined by whether someone's alive and kicking now, but also the research that we do to establish those historical stories as well, but also to reinterpret the significance of something, because certainly with historical material, the reason why a drawing might have been collected originally is not the rationale for why we find it interesting and put it on display now. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple layers.
Mm-hmm. This kind of idea of these afterlives of drawings,
and that's interpretation. I mean, that's art history, that's architectural history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tony, could we ask you also this interesting question about the story? When you do a sketch, that's between you and what you were thinking about bringing into life, as it were, and the sketchbook and your own processes of design. Could you talk a little bit more around, once the drawing exists, is there still a story to it, or is it then in the world and will go forth in certain ways?
Well, it usually sits in a sketchbook and it's forgotten about. I mean, unless you... Well, that's usually what happens. They're very instantaneous, and you might look at them maybe within a period of a month. You might look at them, then you look at them again. Or sometimes I look at old sketchbooks and I see something in the drawing that I could use in a current project, a spatial thing or a compositional thing. So I don't do that very much, but it's something I should do. But then I'm going to give all the sketchbooks away, so I won't have those anyway. So
You can still come and look at them, Tony.
I could come on with some of that old guy looking at his old
We'll give you
sketchbook.
special access.
That's
the
nice.
curator about
Madeleine Friedensdorp, who did all the drawings that went into Delirious, New York, was in the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art, found one of the drawings had been displayed back to front or upside down. And she went to the guard and said, I drew that drawing. They said, would you like to leave, old lady? To throw her out. So one has to be very careful about these things. So, but in terms of what its afterlife is, they with the exception of the sketches that are really old, like a real long time ago, they tend to be contemporary to me. I look at them and they are spatial ideas. I mean, it depends. Sometimes the sketches are about trying to establish a constructional detail, so they're not particularly good to look at afterwards, and not particularly publishable, because they're often drawn very quickly and not. Is this answering your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
No, they're not conceived of to be seen by the people. They're a notation to yourself.
But then, Tony, has your own attitude to the drawings changed?
What, since this?
Well,
Yeah.
you did the sketchbooks with no other audience in mind. You were working something
No.
out. But at a certain point, you came to look at the sketchbooks as a record of a part of your practice.
You people made me see that. Before that, it was just stuff I happened to have in a box. You know.
But you
Really.
did have it. You had kept them,
Yeah.
and you kept them carefully labelled with dates.
But for your own reference at that point?
I think there's an inner archivist in you.
But it could be. Yeah. I mean, you know, you as
So do
but as an architect, you work sometimes at a level that you don't understand. You know, you do things and you don't fully understand why you do them. A lot of architecture is made that way, so it's quite possible that I did want them to be collected, but it seemed rather far-fetched until this happened. And no, it's not. So it's interesting.
I mean, certainly I sense that there was a focus on keeping the sketchbooks together in a way and you were less interested in keeping the larger drawings, and you kept the technical drawings only went as long as you had to. So
Yeah. Well,
was it always clear that the sketchbooks were?
It's a bit more difficult to explain than that. I stopped doing drawings myself, delineated drawings, when we started working digitally, which I like. I like drawing digitally, but I don't produce those. The type of drawing that I showed at the beginning, which was an explanatory axiometric, I don't draw those anymore. My colleagues draw them, and I look at them and I compose them, and so I have some authorial contact, but I don't actually produce some drawings in them. The last set of drawings I did a long time ago, 35 years ago, so that all I have that's personal to me are either drawings that are in digital drawings, which are a sort of compilation of things, and they're interesting actually, and they've got marginal drawings, and but they're digital, so you don't have them. But with a sketchbook, they're there, and they kind of annoy you. You know, you trip over them, and you have to eventually do something with them. Eventually, you have to look at them again. So it's a much more lifelike process that made this come about.
Was the first time that you revisited your sketchbook systematically for the project with drawing matter?
It was that, and also the V&A acquired some, so I had to look at them, and I had to date them as far as I could, and I had to number the sketches that I thought were significant. That's when I looked at them again in doing that, but I hadn't done that before. They just, were there.
there is this sense as a curator of being worried about sort of influencing your subject in that way, and
Changing the story.
yeah, exactly. And I think particularly, depending on when you encounter someone in their career, one's more aware of the impact that one might have, perhaps as someone earlier on in their career, than once they're fully established. And we also talked with Neil McLaughlin and did a fantastic interview with Neil McLaughlin for part of the series of books for Drawing Matter. And he said that he kept all his sketchbooks with the intention of going back to them, but that he hadn't actually gone back to them until we asked him to pull them all out and spread them out on the table for us. And that was the first moment. And there were realizations during that interview that he made that, where he connected projects that he'd done with places that he'd been. And we said, well, when did you realize that the Ripon Chapel in Cuzdon was influenced by Peter Zumthor's something chapel? And he said, just right now. So there are those moments of great excitement and discovery, but also you're sort of aware that you are influencing.
But I don't object to that. What I think about the buildings that people make and the buildings that I make is that they're constantly being reinterpreted, either by people in use or by commentators. And architecture, the designer of a building is a tiny part of the production of architecture. It's about...
But do you see it as a test of a good building that it is subject to that? It absorbs that reinterpretation?
Well, all buildings get reinterpreted, whether they're good or bad, but but a good building can offer more wholesome possibilities and a more generosity of spirit. But what I wanted to go on from that to say is that in as much as buildings are constantly reinterpreted, then the material of sketches is constantly reinterpreted. And so in this process, which I've been kindly asked to be in over the last 2 years, I've had to find a way where as far as possible, I can retain the original meaning of the sketches. So I don't participate in the reinvention of my own history, which would be, I wouldn't want to do that. So I have to try to maintain some clarity of remembrance and be very careful about what I say. But that said, I'm quite happy that this work is abandoned to interpretation by other people.
Can I... Sorry, I don't want to... I'm sure you've got it. But I wanted to ask about the two drawings that you showed, which I think you described as explanatory.
Yeah.
Metrics, where there is an attempt to fix something.
Well,
And are those drawings for you, or you describe them as very much for you, rather than for the client or for some presentation?
but sometimes they're for publication, for a journal. But the motive, after publishing a lot, you start to produce drawings which are publication drawings, which have another level of artistry in them. But at that stage of my life, I didn't know about that, so I did drawings which explained the scheme to myself. Everything that you make is made for somebody else, but it's not consciously directed towards a specific group of people. Even a publication drawing, you can't really know what other people will make of it. So, as an architect, you actually don't make anything. You don't construct anything. It's not like being a painter or a sculptor, where you might, well, not that they do that these days, but you might make something, or a maquette or something. You could make models, which we don't do anymore, but in the end, the actual artifacts that you have are drawings, so that's, in a way, it's a personal issue, not that it's secret, it's just it comes from some desire to say to yourself what you've achieved, to somehow settle your thinking. In architecture, there are lots of possibilities, and you spend a lot of time trying to eliminate those possibilities which are less good and find the ones which instinctively you think have a core of value, which as when made into a building will have that capacity for other people to reimagine it and to just have durée as a piece of cultural production. And then where was I going with this? And the drawing, I've forgotten what I was going to say, sorry. I got lost. So you
No, it seems absolutely that the drawings are actually the last tangible thing in this thing that gets bigger and bigger. Maybe that'll lead us nicely to the next question.
Yeah, no, I was wondering if we might think about the whether there's a certain hierarchy in the afterlives of these architectural drawings, and why some are sort of assumed into collections and others are kind of put aside and sort of confined to more obscure places. And I wondered how that figured in collecting drawings. And it was a question for Neil, really, about is there a sense of hierarchy in the stories that you're trying to collect, and the drawings that you choose, are the ones you pick based on having better stories than other ones?
Or better drawings than other
Yeah.
ones, because
Well,
it's...
Or better, well, yeah, let's hope also better drawings. I don't know, I'm always saying this, but at the Raphael Drawing Show at the...
Can you hear in the back?
Sorry. At the Raphael Drawing Show at the Ashmolean last year, I was talking to one of the curators who said there are 430 Raphael drawings and 30 Raphael, and they're all figure drawings. The such architectural drawings as survive are almost, I think with two exceptions, are on the back of figure drawings and have been preserved because they're... So the first point is, this stuff is just the chance survivor of a really kind of vicious process. I mean, actually they've done their job, and that they're lucky that they were saved by chance or by some instinct of the curator or by...
If they have an afterlife at all, you're saying.
Yeah, so that's the volume of, I think Olivia and I should be relieved, the volume of architectural drawings that have been destroyed is vastly greater than the ones that need to be preserved. I think in terms of, to answer Matt's question, the part of what we do in Somerset is at least to try and find the areas of activity and collecting and choice where the institutions are sometimes in a way prevented in the nature of being institutions. And I was I had a sense with the Canadian Centre for Architecture and the Soane Museum, both of where I was in each case a trustee, that to some extent they had allowed themselves to be defeated by the very objects that they existed to, or their existence was predicated on preserving. So it's not as strong as a critique, but it's very much my saying, what is it that the institutions find hard to deal with? Sketchbooks are a really good example. I'm completely sympathetic to the conservator who says, you know, to the exhibition person who says, well, we can only show one sheet at a time, to the conservator who says, if you keep turning over the pages, they're going to fall to pieces. It's not that I wish to destroy them or rip them apart, but I take this view that they are in the archive in Somerset for who knows how long, but for 10 years or 10 years or 15 years, it's kind of inevitable that they will end up in a much more formal institution. And this is a way of articulating them in this kind of brief period.
So
It's a blink in the life of a drawing in an institution.
So in terms of the hierarchy that you feel yourself in your collection, would you say that your sort of view on the hierarchy is that you will not be defeated by your objects that are in your collection? So just sort of overcoming of what they are.
I suppose that's. I mean, I have a distinct preference for preparatory material over presentation drawings, and also, in fact, over technical drawings, or construction drawings. Although I found ways of extracting interesting information from interesting stories, forgive me, from construction drawings. I mean, the problem with presentation drawings is, first of all, that they are a performance to convince somebody else, but it's also, and this is my argument with architectural history, we know what the buildings look like. So what they can actually tell one that the buildings can't is quite, they can tell you quite a lot about intention, but not really so much about the imaginative process that produced them. Does that answer the question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I think one of the interesting things is just about collecting policy, and whether the collecting policy of the V&A is long established, has changed, has adapted over time, and Neil can decide what he wants to collect in a much more spontaneous way, but also I wonder, I'm going to be interested to know how much you think about the audiences.
Sorry, it's also, and I should absolutely say that the other thing that informs my decisions is that I know I can't have everything. I have this quite small room, and an absolute rule that if I ever open a drawer and see a drawing that I don't remember, I'm going to stop.
Whereas I have a collection so huge that I know that even if I started going through it now and went through it sheet by sheet until I died, I still wouldn't get to the end of it. So I mean, it's a completely different sort of, project.
Certainly, I'm incredibly privileged in terms of the freedom I have to make choices.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting just understanding always when you're looking at a collection about the formative moments in that collection, the rationale at any one particular point, why it has acquired the character that it has. So, for instance, with the V&A's collection, the intention when it was first formed focused very much on ornament. So early acquisitions, particularly acquisitions which came out of the government schools of art and design, do not deal with the planning of buildings. There are hardly any Renaissance drawings that we have which are of plans, but we've got plenty of elevations and ornamental details and grotesque work and window frames and things like that. And that's because of the concentration of the mission of the government schools of art and design, and the concentration of the teachers on ornament. It was a school of ornament, essentially. And so that helps you understand why, when you're looking for fantastic plans in the V&A, you don't necessarily find them.
But it was also, I think, worth saying that in the same context, it was a repository of images. Mm. It wasn't an exploration of process.
Mm. No, not at that point.
Not at that point.
Not at that point. Although it was supposed to be about teaching students how to be good designers. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, there was always an interest in how do you go about designing something well. And that's something which has always formed a backbone for the collection. So that now, when we're collecting things, we do try to document the process of design for one project over time. And that unfolding of an idea is something that we would like to be able to show visually in the drawings that we collect. But another substantial strand, though, in the V&A's collection was about the art of architectural drawing. So Richard Fenner-Spears, who for over 30 years was the head of the Royal Academy Schools, basically set up a collecting initiative where he invited all his friends to contribute drawings to the V&A. And that was in 1911. And so a lot of our strengths in 19th century drawings are the product of Richard Fenner-Spears saying, we really need to be able to show students great examples of architectural drawing. So, what are your best drawings? Pop them into the V&A, and then people will be able to look at them. And at that point, there was a sense, actually, that the RIBA was not a national collection. It was the members, it was the private members' institution, and that therefore there had to be a national collection of architectural drawings, which would be accessible at all times to everyone. So that was focused very much on how people drew, not on the design of a functional building, but on the techniques of rendering, on lettering, on how to do a good wash. And it's those things.
And with the idea, which Teddy may want to comment on, that a beautiful drawing must then produce a beautiful building.
I think there was the drive was about how to make sure that people expressed their buildings.
Their beautiful buildings.
Yeah. But also a lot of emphasis on record drawings. And on measured drawings, because there was a concern that buildings were being destroyed and that the drawings would provide a sure record of historic examples that had been lost, but that would still be useful.
Drawings more effectively than photography, say?
Yes. I mean, we were collecting photographs as well, but there was a special role for the measured drawing.
I wonder if we might sort of skip back a little bit to the point that Neil made about having a small room versus having a national collection.
We still have small rooms. We don't have enough storage space either.
But also the different way of interacting with drawings that comes out of this. Because as you described at the start, Olivia, that to visit the study room at the V&A, you need a specific or relatively specific drawing in mind that you're wanting to come and see.
We acknowledge that there may be people who just want to look at anything, and so we have boxes of, we call them topic boxes, so you could walk in and say, I'm interested in architectural drawing, and we will give you a selection of architectural drawings spanning 5 centuries, just so that you can begin to look at something. So we do cater for the completely sort of unschooled, but equally it's often...
It's a wonderful challenge catching Olivia out with a topic she hasn't thought of. I better wander in next week.
Try apples. We've got lots of, but that runs across the whole. It's not just architecture. So.
But I think to an extent then that these topic boxes they're kind of pre-curated, if you like, even if they're showing a broader range of drawings. Whereas with Neil's collection, and going back to the idea of the small room, I don't know if people can see in this photograph that there's these plan chests here and this shelf storage at the side. And I wondered, Neil, if you might want to talk about how the storage of drawings and the way you store them perhaps impacts the afterlives of them and these kind of unexpected afterlives that they can have.
Turns out that the alphabet is this fantastically valuable, useful tool, and partly because you pull out, M miscellaneous, and you find Peter Markley drawing and Miss van der Rohe drawing, and these conjunctions are actually productive of discussion, particularly where a lot of the visitors we have are practitioner students, and my abiding, I mean, they have, I won't bore everybody, but it's a big topic. How do you engage a practitioner student with a drawing by another architect? One way of doing it is actually just to hand it in miscellaneous folder. The other is to respond if you say, what are you designing now? And they say a staircase, and you show them 20 drawings of staircases. So it is like my version of topics. But it again, and this is the point, this whole setup depends on being small and on there being somebody there, which ends up very often being me, who knows why they came and can tell the story. So there's an element of there being endlessly performed, if you know. I don't know if that was that where you wanted to go.
No, I was wondering also. You can see in this photograph on the table that there's a kind of a few heaps of drawings laid out, and I know that.
I'm not sure anybody in the room can hear you.
I can.
Sorry, it's really.
Is that better? I was wondering your storage of them in these plastic wallets, how that figures in the kind of hierarchy of architectural drawings, and your attitude towards drawings as artworks or drawings that should be preserved in a certain form.
We remove 200 or 300 frames a year from. I mean, I'm sort of staggered by how many architectural drawings do get framed over the years. That's partly a sort of determination on my part that one should look at this material on kind of equal terms. It doesn't actually matter if it's by Le Corbusier or by somebody who one's ever heard of. But so the frames create an artificial distance and are hugely problematic when they become part of the provenance of the drawing. So I could. Aldo Rossi particularly irritating because he loved putting his drawings into not very distinguished old frames, but at that point they become part of the frame, becomes part of the object, and it's very difficult to know exactly. If it's
we don't like keeping things framed because they just take up so much more
well,
room.
there's also the space issue.
So it's partly a space issue. But also you can't look at the back of a drawing if it's framed. I mean, that's the most annoying thing about it. And you can't analyse it properly if it's behind a mountain under glass. But then, as you say, those moments where something is framed as part of its sort of objecthood, then it becomes a different matter. And the V&A, in terms of its broad interest in the history of taste as well, we preserve things in frames sometimes because they are framed at a particular point in time and they're effectively period objects, even if the frame isn't contemporary to the original drawing. So, I don't know, I was looking the other day at an interior design by John Yen, which is in a 1960s frame with very careful watercolour on the mount, and it's not to our taste at all now, but that is a moment in how architectural drawings and interior drawings were treated, and so that will remain framed because it's a good example of its type, and that will be preserved. So I mean, it's each case has to be evaluated, I suppose.
Should we open the floor to the audience? We would invite you also to ask questions either to a specific member of our panel or to all three, depending on the nature of the question. Turn around. Just have to
speak up?
Yeah, could you? Yes, if everyone could join me back and enunciate. We haven't been there. No, it's okay.
You all right?
Yeah, too.
Why not? Try. It may not work.
I wanted to ask Tony a question about the word. Firstly, about the words on the drawings, and whether the words are kind of questions which are answered by the drawings, or whether the words are the answers to the drawings. That kind of relationship between the two.
Thanks. They weren't intended to be shown on a screen at the Courtauld Institute. So it's embarrassing. In fact, all architects have this problem that you write things in sketchbooks and which are jaune, and you prefer it if they weren't seen. And the answer is, the question is, it's hard to say what their status is. It was a question that occurred while you were drawing something, and they'd have, the only way I could describe it is they have some equality as an event in a design, but it's not linear. Does that make sense?
It's not clear which is the question and which is the answer.
No, they occur often at the same time, or as an outcome of, you draw something and you...
And do the words nail what you've achieved in the drawing? That you've worked out something and they describe that something?
It's much more, it's much vaguer than that. It's often, in fact, the sketches, the resolution of a building, a part of a building in sketches, is often actually only achieved by drawing, a technical drawing of it. And so sketches and the words in sketchbooks they're quite provisional. I'm not evading the question, but that's as I remember it.
I think if one of the notes that we came across actually in the session just before suggests perhaps the reciprocal nature of the relationship. Underneath a number of sketches which you'd done on one page, you'd written, "It is clear you must either accept this solution or find another."
This is so embarrassing, I can't tell you.
And having looked at a lot of Tony's sketches, that there is an amazing iterative quality to his sketching. It's that constant probing and exploring and trying one thing and trying an alternative. Often you'll find, maybe across a double spread, 5 different details of essentially the same problem, and they're all slightly different. They're all alternatives. And then occasionally you'll find one of them will have yes, with a big circle around it, above it. Or I've noticed also the via negativa of no, 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 and then there's one without a no next to it, which by a process of elimination one concludes is the least of all evils. So I think, but that to what I've seen at least, it seems to me that there's a reciprocal relationship. There are also lots of very funny sort of personal provocations. I haven't told you that one of my favourite sheets that I spotted when I was at Tony's house going through all these sketchbooks. There are often exhortations, such as "perfect the arts of action, you slick bastard." So it's a personal.
And before you give sketchbooks away, go through them with Snowpeg. Then be
I will look for that one again.
Okay.
You can't take that one out.
No, I won't.
Everything you showed us was very purposeful.
No.
But what about drawing for pleasure?
I do drawings for pleasure, but they're amusing. They're usually drawings to people I care for, but I don't do any life drawings. I keep thinking I should, some artistic drawing, but I actually can't do it. I'm a very limited draftsman.
But you would still draw buildings?
Yeah.
But not your building?
You mean other people's drawing? No, I don't draw other people's buildings. I used to, but I take photographs of them now. When I was in my late 20s and still had just graduated, draw buildings on the assumption that you learn something about them, but actually, the imagery that comes to mind is Francis Bacon buying art books and tearing the pages out that he liked, and getting a tiny something from them, or a bear catching a salmon and eating its ear and throwing the rest away. It's a bit like that. You kind of, what you get from other people's buildings, well, what I get from other people's buildings is much more complicated. It's a possibility. You know, when I look at other people's buildings, I look at them for my own purposes.
So if you draw for pleasure, what do you draw?
That's things that I send to people I care for. That's all I'm going to say. They're funny. They're caricatural and, you know, amusing, and they're part of a texting thing or something like that. I do a lot of drawings which I send by text instead of writing. I don't write letters anymore. I kind of, the idea of sitting down writing letters, laborious. But I do lots and lots of drawings that I send to people, and in private conversations, that's where I draw. And they're never going to be published, ever. Ever.
If you haven't looked at Tony's Twitter feed, I thoroughly recommend it to you, because it's part of, now I would say it's part of his sketchbook practice, in terms of documenting tiny details and incidental details on in quite a sort of compulsive way, and in an iterative way as well. So often returning to the same themes, cracks in paving stones, or details on a bus, the form of a handle on public transport. I mean, things like that, tiny little things which are utterly quotidian, but which, once you start scrolling through them, these patterns emerge, and you begin to understand also how, I suppose, the worldview that is expressed in Tony's sketchbooks is the same worldview that you see in the photographs that he takes. And that those two things actually dovetail.
Yeah. Well, one of my students asked me why I had a long time photographing videos on buses. You know, the video surveillance systems on buses. And I like the colour and the composition, but he pressed me to, and then there was a series of benches and seats, and I thought about it, and I said, but somebody had designed these things, an unacknowledged designer designed these things, so this is a way of saying that it was done by somebody. You know, one of the characteristics of those normative objects is that they become unauthored, which is interesting, but it's also cruel, you know, because somebody sat and designed it. There's a great line from a W.H. Auden poem, which I'll misquote. So I don't know much about architecture, but it seems that everything from the Parthenon to the Albert Memorial was designed by one very old man. And I kind of, so that anonymity is part of what we do. You know, people make objects. Somebody designed this. Somebody made a series of decisions with this, the table, the glass, the carpet. Somebody designed this, and well, that's socially unjust not to recognise that in a way, you know. But also these things come alive if you know that somebody had a consideration for them. And also they talk about the times we're in, you know, that if you would find a 1960s desk microphone, it would be completely different in style. And drawings, actually, when you say that you remove frames, the moment in time when the drawing was made, you can see, well, within memorable history, you can get a very strong sense of the value system and the social structure was behind that drawing, you know. I mean, even drawings from the 60s, which I saw in the 60s as new, if I look at them again, and they're, you know, the whole social fabric behind them is changed. So if you're a maker of objects, then you have to be fascinated by this stuff. The world of objects gets more exciting if you credit them with some existence more than just your noticing them, you know? And that's what those photographs might be about.
Other questions or just comments? I'll take a few minutes. Yeah.
I suppose something I noticed as a young architect.
You speak up. It's a bit far away. Well, I can
So I suppose as a young architecture student, I've noticed it's quite
we can't
difficult.
hear you now. It's really
It's quite difficult to get noticed for your work, and you're kind of, I suppose, put into companies where you're kind of doing, I suppose, the smaller amount of things and not going into the big things. Do you think there is a requirement for architecture or such anymore?
What was the question?
So, I suppose, you have the construction business and you have architectural technologists. They're doing all the work that's required.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The question of a young architect just starting out in a big firm, that kind of question of,
Is there still a role for architects as architects more than as sort of?
You mean the question of authorship when you're working for somebody else?
Or a big practice, or in a big practice, yes.
But in any practice, but in a big practice, no, you work in a big practice for other reasons, and a lot of people working in offices don't require authorship. They just are happy with participation. The desire to have an account, like a recognizable product from your thinking in hand, it's quite rare actually in design. There are very few people who actually make the design work, and the majority of people working in offices execute a design and they get their pleasure from that, you know. So it's unless you work in an office that's horrid, you generally get satisfaction. You know, I haven't ever felt when I work for other people that I was being robbed of opportunity. I thought I was working with people that I chose to work with. But in a way, early on in your career, you don't want too much responsibility. You don't have enough knowledge. So you working in a larger office, you're part of a bigger effort, and then you have to, somewhere along the line, you decide if you want to have an independent presence. But a lot of people don't. They want to work in practice forever. Does that make sense to you? Good.
How did you form your own identity as an architect when you were working for other people? Because it seems to me you worked hard at deciding what kind of an architect you wanted to be, and how did that fit with being in other people's practices?
Well, I think in retrospect, I think you shouldn't think that you're going to change the work of a practice where you work. And I have had a particular instance of somebody who worked in my practice who introduced quite a lot of their own thinking into a project, which we then had to undo because it wasn't very good. And so I wouldn't let that happen again. I think if you work for me, you work for me, and you're part of the conversations. The intellectual fabric of the office is open, but you express yourself when you choose to become an author, and that's a large step. I had a long conversation with a friend of mine, a younger architect, who said that people in his office were asking him to be more assertive. What should he do? And I said, well, very few people have the combination of talents to be an independent office and say something different. And so you have that combination. So you have the right and the duty and even the responsibility to lead. That's how it works, you know. If you work for somebody that you admire, you can bring something to the conversation, but you shouldn't expect to greatly influence the design. Otherwise, it stops being the work of that office. But to answer your question, my formation came after I left. When I went on my own, then I had to figure out the architecture that I wanted. And there was a period of time where I didn't do work that was particularly interesting for my own practice, and it was it took probably 5 to 10 years working in my own practice to know what I wanted to say. And this moment in the Lisson Gallery was pivotal, because then I did establish the sensibility by which I've worked ever since. But that took a long time.
And was that, Tony, the nature of that commission, or what you'd learnt in the 10 years on your own?
It was a combination of things, but a lucky break, meeting Nicholas, who was very open to hiring me, and the combination of things that I was doing and the interests that I had. So, complete luck. They're really important moments in an architect's life. That moment where these things cross over. That, you know, that's what makes you what you are.
Other questions?
Well, I think we can wrap up. I would like to, first of all, thank all of you for coming and finding your way here. I want to thank all of the students of the Courtauld Architecture Society for putting on this event and the hard work of my colleague here, Matthew, and the three of you, to Niall Hobhouse and to Tony Fretton, to Elizabeth, Olivia, for coming and creating this conversation and this event for us. There's a reception on the next floor, if you can find it. Maybe you can follow some of us or some of the student leaders to the reception, but I really don't miss it just because you have to go up a level. We have wonderful refreshments, and we can have more of an informal conversation. So just to the three speakers, thank you so much this evening.